when you're looking for the range of a function when given its graph, all we care about is what y values are included on our graph, from the smallest y value to the largest y value. So when we talk about y values, that's always in the up and the down direction. So when we talk about the range, we're always going to talk about the smallest y values, which would be the bottom down here, up to the top, right? Those would be our largest y values up there at the top. So in this graph, we have a line that is pointing down forever, right? When we talked about domain, we said it was pointing to the left forever, right? But now it's pointing down also forever. So our domain should start with the lowest possible y value that exists, which would be negative infinity. And our upper limit is, well, this arrow indicates that we're pointing up and going up and up and up forever. So we're going up towards positive infinity. And just like with domain, the range will be done in interval notation for us, and we'll always use parentheses on infinities. For this one, we have to look from bottom to top. So we look along the y-axis until our function is at its lowest point. Our function is at its lowest point right down here where it has an endpoint. Right? That would be at -1 for y. Make sure you don't use -6. That's the x value. Right? That'd be for the domain. We'll use -1, and because it's a closed endpoint, we'll put a bracket. Then we go all the way along this line here, and there are no breaks in it. And so we just see that the arrow at the end tells us we're pointing up forever, so we'll go towards infinity. And infinity will always have a parenthesis for us. For this one, again, we need to look at what's the lowest possible value on our graph. Our lowest value is right here at this endpoint, which is -4 on the y-axis. So we'll start at -4 with a bracket because it's a closed endpoint, not an open endpoint. And this graph has an arrow pointing to the left and up forever. We care about the fact that it's going up towards positive infinity forever. A lot of people make the mistake of putting a negative there because it's going to the left where the x values are negative, but we're talking about y values. Going up means positive infinity. Okay? Make sure you always go from bottom to top. For this one, our lowest value on this line segment is down here at this closed endpoint. That'd be when y is -4. So we'll start with -4 and a bracket. Then, as we move along our line segment, we end up here at an open endpoint where the y value is 2. So we'll go from -4 to 2. And because it's an open endpoint, we won't use a bracket, we'll use a parenthesis. So our range is -4 to 2. Once they're no longer lines or line segments, they start to get a little bit trickier. A lot of people make the mistake of saying that we'll start with the lowest value here. If you look along here, the lowest value is right here at this little corner that we've got, right? The graph never goes below that. We have an arrow indicating that it's going to go up after that forever. And there's no other points along the line of it where it's below -2. So we're going to start with -2 for this point right here. Right? We don't have a point actually indicated with like a closed or an open point because it's in the middle of our graph. If it's in the middle of your graph and it doesn't have a little open circle there, then you will assume that the point is included and use it with a bracket. Now, there are multiple mistakes that people often make for the top end of the range on a graph like this. They may just look at the endpoint over here and say, oh, that endpoint is 3. The top of my range must be 3. Well, that's not true, right? We're not going to use that endpoint because if we look, there are portions of my graph that are clearly shown above 3. So 3 cannot be the end of my range. Now, another mistake that people often make is they say, oh, well, the highest I can see, the highest it looks like it goes there is 4, right? And if I even drew the line across here, there sure aren't any points that it looks like it's above 4, right? But if you put a 4 there, you're still going to be wrong because we've got an arrow over here at the end, which indicates this thing is going up forever. And if I were to extend that line at 4 across, clearly we now have some places where we go above 4. So this range actually extends all the way up to infinity with a parenthesis. So just be careful about that, right? Sometimes the arrow might be drawn way below what looks like the top of your range, right? But really, that arrow is indicating that that thing continues to go up and up and up forever, way past 4, up to 4 billion and 4 billion times 4 billion, and just huge, huge numbers. So be careful on those. Okay. So similar to the issue we had with the last one, we want to make sure, like, let's check and make sure there's no arrows on our endpoints. So in this one, neither of our endpoints have arrows. So we shouldn't have infinity or negative infinity as part of our range here. Okay? So now we just want to look at what's the lowest possible value on our graph. Well, it looks like right down here, right, that's the lowest our graph goes. That would be at y equals -2. So we'll start with -2. And because it's not an open circle and it's not an infinity, we'll put a bracket. Okay. Then as we go up, we need to be a little careful because we might see something like an open endpoint here and think we need to exclude 0, like leave out 0 from our range. But there are other points on here where our graph equals 0. So we don't want to leave 0 off of our range. Just because we don't have 0 over here doesn't mean we might not have 0 at some other places, right? We have 0 at other places there. So we don't need to exclude 0. Then as you look up further, you'll see another open circle here, right, at y equals 2. But if you look across at y equals 2, there's clearly a point here, and there's clearly a point here. So we don't want to leave 2 off from our domain either. So we'll just continue up all the way until we get to 4. There's nothing above 4 that we can see, and we have no arrows indicating that we would go above 4. And because 4 doesn't have any point indicated there, that means that it's an included point, right? There's no open circle there. So we'll just go from -2 to 4 with a bracket. For this one, we want to look at our lowest possible value. So if we look at the endpoints, this endpoint doesn't have an arrow, so we don't have to worry about that one. If we look at this endpoint, it does have an arrow. So we should be eventually going up towards infinity, but we don't have to worry about going down towards negative infinity. So just visually looking at this, the lowest we go is right here at -1. And because it's an open circle there and all the way across here, there are no other points at -1, we'll just say -1 with a parenthesis. And as we go along here, we can see there are points at -1 and all of these up to 2. And then we kind of go back down below 2. Just because there's an open circle there doesn't mean that I might not have other points at that same y value. So I don't need to exclude 1. We've clearly gone through 1. We've gone at least to 2 right up here, right? We've gone at least to 2. And if we look over here, we keep going above 2 all the way up to positive infinity. So there are no exclusions on this graph outside of this interval -1 to infinity with their primes. All right, This is our last one here. Again, we'll check the endpoints. This one indicates that it's going to the right, which we don't care about, but also up, which we do care about. But there are no arrows on the other end indicating that we're going down towards negative infinity. So we'll just start with the lowest value that we see. The lowest value we can see is this value at -4. And since it's an open circle, we'll have a parenthesis. And as we go up, we hit every value along here until we get to -2. If we look across at -2, there are no other values at -2, which means we have to end part of our range there at -2. And I put a parenthesis because it was an open circle. Then if you look between -2 and -1, there are no pieces of our graph there. We don't pick back up until we are at a y value of -1. So we'll put a U for union, a bracket because the value at -1 is clearly included, and then we have values of y at -1, and then going up from -1 until we get to 2. At 2, there are no other values of our function that go through there at 2. So we'll have another break at 2 with a parenthesis because it was an open circle. We'll put another U because we still have some range values above that. There's nothing between 2 and 3, but at 3 with a closed endpoint, we pick back up and go up forever towards infinity. So it should be 3 to infinity. And so that's our range for this one. Remember to always go from bottom to top when you're looking for your range.